Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. I know we still have some more people that are going to be funneling in, but we can go ahead and get started. So, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you so much for joining us for day 2 of Summit. I hope you've been enjoying yourself thus far. My name is Amina Patton. I'm a Senior Academic Partnerships Manager here at Coursera, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our session today, Building Inclusive Trauma-Informed Classroom Communities, which will be led by Erin Hipple from Westchester University. Couple of housekeeping kind of notes. If you need to use captioning at all during the session, you can access those at the bottom of your screen in Zoom to be able to turn those on. We'll be doing a lot of engagement in the chat, so make sure you have that open and that you'll be able to drop in your comments and your feedback. But if you have questions, use the Q&A feature in Zoom. That way, none of your questions will get lost in the chat as we go. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Erin.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be with you here today and to talk about something that is very important to me, which is building trauma-informed and inclusive classroom communities. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to share my screen and offer my PowerPoint, and I will let you know that there will be a read-only version of this available to you. So in the event that I don't get thoroughly through every single slide, please know you'll have access to this, and you're always welcome to reach out with any questions you might have about anything that comes up. So can I just check in and make sure folks can see this first slide?
We're seeing the presenter view right now, Erin.
Oh, okay. It's funny, I've been using Zoom since 2020. You would think I would have that streamlined by now. Let me give this one more try. Thanks, Amina.
Still seeing presenter view.
There we go. How about now?
Perfect.
Awesome, thank you. So folks, what I would love to do is just start with a brief embodiment-based check-in with you. And this is something I do with my students, and we're going to do a shorter version of it together today. And I just invite you to engage in whatever way you feel most comfortable. If engaging experientially feels good to you, that's great. If you're interested in engaging in more of an intellectual way and just sort of listening along, that is also so welcome. So whatever feels good to you, eyes open or closed, moving or still, all is welcome. So what I would first offer is just to maybe notice what it's like to be coming into a new workshop from wherever you came before this Zoom room, and just settling into a new presenter, a new topic. And one of the first places you might check in is with your breath. So, and if the breath is not a comfortable place for you to start, you are welcome to let that go. But if it is, I would just invite you to notice the quality of energy that you might be feeling with your breath right now. Noticing whether it feels easy, labored, somewhere in between. Noticing maybe the depth of your breath right now. Noticing if maybe just by noticing it changes. And just inviting us to settle in together. And again, if the breath isn't a place to be, maybe you want to notice the parts of your body touching a surface and just notice that connection, whether it be to the chair you're sitting in or your feet on the floor. I love seeing all of the greetings coming in, so maybe we can even be orienting to those as more people say hello. And when that feels complete, maybe noticing what you are noticing in your body right now. And oftentimes we'll be drawn to places of maybe discomfort, which makes a lot of sense that our nervous system would kind of pick up on discomfort first. So maybe just noticing if there's any tension, tightness, adjusting if you need to, stretching if you need to, standing if you need to. Um, and maybe noticing any areas of freedom or ease. And then as a final bit of this brief check-in, I just want to offer us to maybe notice What mood are you in today? How are you? And I do this with students as a way to witness emotions in the space. And I really invite you to share, if you would like to be witnessed, how you're feeling in the chat. I usually use this with students as a way to name the emotion and not necessarily the story attached to it, but wanting to invite anything that's here today. Maybe it's excitement, maybe it's anxiety, maybe it's overwhelm, fatigue, irritation. But the purpose of checking in is to say, yeah, how are you feeling? And your feelings are welcome here, whatever they are, not just the ones we consider to be palatable feelings, because we show up in these spaces with all different uh, emotions, and that's okay. And by the way, if you see something in the chat, I'm seeing relaxed and happy, and you resonate with something that someone's sharing, thank you to those who are sharing. Please feel free to put a little emoji to let folks know, oh, that resonates, or oh, I empathize with those feelings, whatever may be showing up. Yeah, I found out there was an octopus emoji. I've never looked back. It makes me so happy that you can use all of the emojis in the Zoom chat. So, and I invite you to engage throughout, folks. I really love that. Although I may, for the sake of time, have to attend to what I can, please feel free to engage and respond to one another. So, real quick agenda. I am going to do the check-in. We did it. We're going to do a quick icebreaker, again, something to use in class that we get to play with ourselves. And isn't that great? So an experiential opportunity to do so. I'll tell you a little bit about me, why I'm offering this workshop, and then the rest will be about setting the stage for trauma-informed and inclusive classrooms, some things to keep in mind, some things you're probably already doing, just to be able to put some language to it if you haven't already, and I don't assume you haven't already. And I'm really hoping to also be sourcing community wisdom here so that we can learn from one another, because some of the best conversations I have about teaching is the ways in which we as a community can often really give one another a lot of support and great ideas. And there will be an opportunity for you to do that in this workshop as well. So for our first icebreaker, before you answer the question on the screen, I want to give a little context. And I also want to point out that this exercise actually comes from Rua Benjamin's book, Imagination, a Manifesto. And I thought that was so cool, given that Rua was the keynote for this conference. So Acorn, to give you a little context, is the name of a community in Octavia Butler's Parables series that the protagonist Lauren finds when she is traveling with a group of people from Los Angeles, which has been destroyed in the wake of apocalyptic events. This community, Acorn, is based on equality and cooperation and tries to be free of all forms of exploitation and oppression, which is, in the story, the mirror opposite of the world surrounding it, a utopian enclave within a dystopian world. Acorn is a cooperative based on democracy, equality, kindness, and ecological sustainability. And so what I would love for you to put in the chat, if you're willing to share, is that if you were a resident of this community, what skill would you bring? And I invite you, you're welcome to think within your role as an educator, if that's where your mind is, but even outside of that role, what skill would you bring? And feel free to start putting those things in the chat as you think of them. Oh, I'm already seeing gardening and woodwork. It makes me so happy. I am an amateur forager and herbalist, and I have some yarrow right outside my window, and that will stop bleeding. And it's really cool to know that and to have that skill with plantkin. So I just love all of the food preservation, storytelling, curiosity. I did this with a class this summer, and boy, it was so cool to see the variety of skills people brought. The people who would be planning the prom in the community, and the people who would be helping to build the shelters, cultivate the food, mediate between people. Oh, I'm seeing them come in. Look, folks, we've got such a robust community of skills that we can bring. Yeah, humorist. Thank you all so much for sharing. Listening, peacemaker, working hard at the task at hand. Yeah, this is where leadership skills can be so powerful. Awesome. This can be a really cool icebreaker to use with students. And one of the things I really love about it, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is it really invites us in our humanity outside of just the one prescribed role of educator learner. Um, but also, what else might we learn about one another if we were to ask those questions? And I suspect there are a lot of really beautiful icebreakers that you all use. Please feel free to include them and share them in the upcoming Padlet if you like. So a little bit about me. And forgive me because I am navigating a PowerPoint on top of PowerPoints and PowerPoints to try to stay on track. This is a little bit of information about me. I'm not going to talk about all of it. I'm more interested in the content today. But what I will tell you is I work as an assistant professor of graduate social work. I am a trauma therapist and I am a coach. And my coaching work often is about helping educators and other professionals be embodied in their work. What it means to be able to be connected on the inside with what's happening on the outside. And these are ways in which we can sometimes mitigate stress and burnout and feel as though we can show up more authentically in the spaces that we hold for students. I took a meandering journey. It's taken me a lot of different places through theater, through English writing, through psychology, pre-medical studies. And then I landed in social work for my second master's and my PhD. And if you have any questions about my training or lineage, again, this will be available to you in the document. And I so welcome you to reach out to me with any questions you have. I think it's important to know where the folks who talk about these things, where we come from and how we learn what we know. But again, 40 minutes. I'm going to move on to just orienting you to some principles of trauma-informed care. So trauma-informed care, and in this context, this graphic comes from the University of Buffalo School of Social Work and is oriented toward client and agency relationships, has 5 basic tenets, which you can see listed here. Safety, choice, collaboration, trustworthiness, and empowerment. And while I'm not going to read through every single piece of writing underneath these, I think it is worth just sort of taking a look at this. And I'm wondering how many folks might be noticing that actually we already do a lot of things that would align with trauma-informed care in the classroom. What it means to give our students a sense of physical and emotional safety, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a later moment in this workshop. How do we offer our students choice? And if you are a student attending this, or maybe simultaneously educator student, which I was for a time, maybe be thinking about the classroom spaces where you've experienced these things and why that mattered to you, right? Where students have choice, what it means to share power, power with instead of power over. How to foster trustworthiness, which in the case of trauma-informed care in social work has to do a lot with boundaries, clarity, and consistency. And then empowerment. How are we helping build skills so that folks are able to use those skills in a way independent or interdependent of us? So those are the 5 tenets of trauma-informed care. And here is where I would love to hear from you. And while we won't get to the final result of the Padlet necessarily in this workshop today, I hope you'll save it. I hope you'll consider contributing later if you're maybe in a place of like, I can't contribute a single thing right now, but maybe save it for later so that you're able to. How do we do this in the classroom? How are we doing this in the classroom? So the QR code will take you to a Padlet where these questions associated with each tenet of trauma-informed practice are written out for you with spaces for you to respond. What strategies do you use to promote safety in your classes? If you're a student, what have you noticed that has allowed you to feel more or less safe? And we'll talk about the word safe soon. Choice. What ways do students have choice? What places might choice be available that are not immediately evident? Collaboration, how do power dynamics show up in the classroom? I do an exercise in one of my classes all about mapping the power dynamics in the space, because I find that often students have a collapsed idea of power. And I think it can be really important in fostering transparency, which is another part of trauma-informed practice, that we are transparent about what we can do and what we can't. And one of the ways I foster transparency is to invite a dialogue about who has power when, because power is a complicated matrix and oftentimes it's Not well, it's not uncommon in my experience for students when I ask them who has power in this classroom for them to point at me. Be like, you have power. That's true. But how do we also help students see the power that they have and how that power is being enacted in the space? So, how do those dynamics show up in your classroom? What ways can you or do you collaborate with students to create power with spaces? Trustworthiness, how do you maintain boundaries while still getting to show up in an authentic way? How are you fostering clarity and consistency? And what's that like for you? And then what environments have you felt most supported in your skill building? I would love to hear about these experiences insofar as anyone is willing to share, and whether you choose to engage with that now or put it aside until the workshop is over. It will be open indefinitely so that hopefully we can maybe see ourselves reflected in the responses of others here, because I suspect that there will be congruences and we might get some lovely new things to think about. So these are some ways some questions we might ask ourselves when we're wanting to attune to whether we are in a trauma-informed classroom space. And something else that feels important is to mention that trauma-informed spaces are for everyone, and that includes you. I think we can get really focused on creating an experience for students, and that's so important. But trauma-informed spaces ideally are trauma-informed for everyone. And one of the ways I think about this in social work agency practice is, are your staff feeling supported? Does your staff have choice? And when we think about universities and university structures, we have to be so mindful about the language we use in terms of what is actually showing up, because you as a professor or an educator of whatever type you are who brings you into this classroom workshop today, this is for you too. So be thinking about that, right? Is how do we make these spaces trauma informed for everyone? And that does get to include us. So I want to shift into embodiment. And why embodiment? Because in my experience, what has worked best for me, and this is admittedly also connected to my lineage and what I feel confident and skilled at, is taking an embodied and relational approach to classroom spaces. And the reason why embodiment in particular can be such a powerful vehicle for trauma-informed classrooms is because sometimes academic spaces can really put us in our heads, can really put us in a state of being thinkers. And many times we're feeling as well. We are feeling beings, and students are feeling things, and we as educators are feeling things in the classroom moments, even when we might be talking about theoretical material. In the work that I do, I often find myself talking about a wide variety of topics that are bound to evoke emotions. Um, and so it feels important to name that as such, knowing how you're feeling can be a really powerful way of recognizing where our responses, where our facilitation might be coming from. If an issue that arises with a student question or frustration, um, us knowing our anchor and knowing what we're feeling helps us respond in a way that lets us slow down. It's called the time and space principle. That's what I'm referring to here in the slide, because it turns out our brains often in higher education are thinking really quickly and analyzing really quickly, but the body actually needs time and space. If I were doing a full somatic check-in with all of you, an embodiment check-in, I will sometimes spend the first 10 minutes of class on this, because it takes a little bit of time to be able to settle and to be able to really notice what's happening. And part of that is because when you come into a classroom, even on Zoom, you're orienting to a bunch of new stimulus. And so how do we practice individually and collectively settling together and slowing down? And it's such a funny juxtaposition, because in the context of this workshop, I have 40 minutes to give you all of this information I so very much want to give you. And the structure of that itself is one that I'm feeling in my body right now, of this speed upness of like, oh, I got to go quick because I got to keep those timings on point, right? And so noticing that and finding ways that we can even disrupt that slightly together. And this feels particularly important when we are having a conflictual interaction, or students are having a conflictual interaction with one another in the classroom space, because it is in those moments that oftentimes we feel an urgency, an understandable one that has a whole kind of interesting neurophysiological explanation at times. But there's often an urgency that occurs, and it isn't that we don't want to listen to that, but how do we find a way to take a moment and slow down? How do we invite our students to do the same? And that itself can be a really powerful practice. So what you see portrayed here in the picture is the emotion sensation wheel, which has been created by a person named Lindsay Brahman. And this is something I use in my therapy and coaching practice, but also give to folks in my classrooms. And I recommend going to Lindsay's website. It's a low cost to purchase this for use. And it's a really beautiful, colorful, and there's a black and white one you can color if you want. And it gives some ideas of how you might start to connect an emotion to a sensation. Now, of course, we want to acknowledge that people feel things a lot of different ways. And so this is by no means the map that is going to tell everyone what sensation is connected to what feeling, but it often gets, or emotion feeling, right? Sensation feeling and emotion feeling. But it often is a starting point for us and for our students to think more expansively about what we're feeling and how we know and what's telling that to us in our bodies. And so the time and space principle is really just kind of a fun way, because some of my mentors and teachers say the body needs time and space, but it's a fun way to say, wow, what if we slow down right now? And what if we set the stage for there to be permission to do that? And that's what I want to also talk about as a means of offering you something pragmatic to take into community, into your classroom communities, to make that possible. So I'm going to get to that in just a moment. And thank you for bearing with me as I navigate all of my tech. One of the first things I have learned as an educator, and again, I imagine I'm not alone, is that self-inquiry is often a really important place to start. I talk here about issues of oppression because those come up in a lot of my classes. But of course, I also teach a class called Oppression and Liberation. So these are things that come up in my classes as a part of the structure of them. For some of us, maybe those conversations don't come up as often, but might. And so I would encourage folks, and again, thinking about these questions is not something that I expect one can do for the time that this slide is available to you on screen in this moment, but I offer these questions to you as a way to just reflect, maybe later on, maybe you're reflecting a little bit now about what we bring, um, what we've experienced. Because if we've experienced a really traumatic, conflictual situation in a classroom, whether it be with students who have very sort of vastly opposing ideas, or whether we find ourselves in great opposition to something a student is disclosing, those things, we sort of map those things. It can create, we internally might feel a little bit of not wanting to engage. Some of us are maybe going to naturally process through that. Others might find ourselves feeling like, ooh, I don't want that to come up again. Ooh, I'm really going to try to avoid that. What can I do to avoid it, right? So just noticing what your experience is, because that matters. It influences, how we experience the classroom. We can also experience trauma. Um, I don't have time to delineate all of the types of trauma. I know that word can get a little bit uh, multi-meaning-ish, but that's a workshop for another time. But where are our edges, and how are we exploring them? How are we setting stage for a space that lets all of us, including the educator, show up in our full humanness? Of course, with the idea of wanting to have boundaries, but there should be some element of being able to show up in our full humanness too. How do you feel in your body when you teach? I can tell you the first few years I taught, I didn't feel my body at all. I was a dynamic teacher. I was a theater major and I love to teach. It's a kind of beautiful performance that feels really meaningful to me. But what I noticed was I was actually leaving my own body behind in the process. And students seemed to really enjoy my classes. So I assumed, well, I'm doing it right. I'm doing really well. And then a few years into teaching, I found myself feeling so exhausted afterward, physically exhausted, and wanting to find ways to navigate that. And I found that embodiment helped me do that. And then getting involved. Should this be a calling, right? How are we advocating for equitable, inclusive spaces outside the classroom? Are we listening to marginalized voices in our classrooms, in our academic communities, and in broader justice movements? Because something I notice is that oftentimes when a student speaks up and speaks about something that they feel has happened, that oppression has happened in the classroom in some way, um, or that harm has been done in the classroom in some way, whether by another student or by the professor, that often it is what we do next that matters. It matters that we caused the initial harm, certainly. But when I have talked to students who have experienced classrooms where they have felt really unsafe, it is often when they have voiced an idea and the response from the educator is one born of urgency, either trying to shut the conversation down because maybe there's an anxiety there. And so, how do we get into, or needing to say, no, but this is the right perspective, which may not be explicitly what is being said, but often that is what students receive. And we can't always control what students receive, but it can be really powerful to shift our intentions to being right with the people in our classrooms before we worry about whether or not we are empirically right in the content. And some of that means slowing down. So, in terms of how are we listening? And how are we noticing if defensiveness arises in us because we maybe don't have the answer right away, or we maybe feel in disagreement with something a student is offering us? Because all of those things are things we I don't want to speak for the big we in this room, but things that I have certainly felt. And then what does it mean to slow down um, in order to navigate that? So one way that I do this, and this is something I'm hoping folks can take away as a pragmatically useful skill, and you may do some version of this already, but at the start of every class, I do community agreements. And these agreements are, we spend a lot of time, like sometimes a full class session. Now, I have classes that are around 2.5 to 3 hours long now. My summer classes are 4 hours long. It's wild. But oftentimes, I'm wanting to spend at least an hour to an hour and a half on this. I want students to get to know each other because I know that if they build relationships with one another, it becomes a lot easier when those conversations arise. And these agreements help buffer that. And so I have a quote here. There's a conversation in the room that only these people in this moment can have. Find it. And so while I do this with every class, I don't anticipate the same result with every class. And the reason I do it is building relationships, getting student voices in the space right away. I do this before I go over the syllabus. I prioritize the relationship over the content in the first few classes. And then embodied exploration with students to help them differentiate and to remind me to differentiate the difference between discomfort and danger. Because when we feel contradicted and it's about something important to us or something about our identity, I can tell you as a non binary person, these kinds of things come up in some of the spaces I inhabit. How am I telling the difference between the threat that I may feel and where I am in my edge? And helping students think through that is something that often comes up in these agreements. Checking in with what's here, who's here, and how they are thinking about the classroom space. And I always invite us to be mindful about how we ask people to manage emotions. There are cultural differences between everything from vocal loudness, the ways that emotions are expressed. We have to be really mindful of navigating this in our classrooms in a way where we're not tone policing people. And also, we're finding a way for us to navigate this together so that we have some roadmap, right? And this is also inviting collaboration, inviting open doors if a conflict arises, that doesn't mean we shut it down. Many students have said to me, we were having a conversation, it felt incomplete, usually about a sort of high stress topic, and then next class, it was as though it never happened. Professor didn't bring it up again. Nobody brought it up again. And so inviting collaboration and open doors is another underpinning of these agreements, as well as unraveling terminology and processing coded language. One such example is professionalism. If I invite someone to be professional in the classroom, I want to talk about what that means because my dissertation was about the problem with that term, at least in part, and the ways in which it has been coded to be oppressive to BIPOC folks, to women and femmes, to lots of different types of folks across the course of professionalism as we understand it as a concept. And so this is an opportunity for us to start getting really clear with our students what we mean. And that can foster a lot of trauma-informed care principles, safety, empowerment, trustworthiness, for example. And so this is a brief breakdown of the process. You will have access to this again once this workshop is over, but the TLDR is that I split students in two groups. If it's a bigger class, you have to get creative. Sometimes I had a class of 120. I had them talk in dyads in one section of that class. I had another class get into many smaller groups together and sort of split them up to see who came up with similar and different things. Anyway, I invite creativity there. And if you need any support around that, I'm happy to make suggestions. But anyway, two groups in my classes, which are usually around 20 people. And I have one group of students get together and talk, usually 20 to 25 minutes, about what they need from the students in the class to have a space conducive to their learning. And I'm very specific to say a space conducive to their learning. I'll talk about that with one of the final slides. So those students will talk about what they need from their fellow students. And then I have the second group talk about what they need from me as a professor to have a space conducive to their learning. But the purpose of this is actually to have a bit of a democratic process in the sense that group one will present what their group came up with. And then we open the floor for myself and group two to ask questions, to add things. This is a living document, so I put this up in the electronic, we use D2L, some folks use Canvas. I put it up there for all students to have access to. It gets typed up in the end. So group one talks about what they need from fellow students. We ask questions. I might say, for example, every time students will say something like non-judgmental, and it often invites such robust and beautiful conversation when I say, I would be so interested to hear who in here could say that you are non-judgmental, because actually we're judging each other all the time, and that's not always bad. But this is a way to get students thinking critically about the language we use and what it is they're actually asking for and what their expectations are in the space. So that can be a really fun way to get students really getting specific. And it also helps foster things like trustworthiness and safety because then the terms are clearer with regard to what we mean. And so once we all agree that we put together what we need from that section, we move to group two. They share what they need from me. I'm always excited to see what students are wanting and needing from me. And sometimes this is a lovely point of getting to know students, and often they are informed by their past experiences in classrooms. That's part of what informs, and we talk a little bit about that, the stories that underpin why they're asking for what they're asking for. Sometimes the conversation goes there, sometimes it doesn't. But students often start to reveal themselves in a way that I'd like to hope lets them feel seen, and by some student report does. So we do the same, ask them what they need from me, and then I share what I need from them and invite them to ask me questions about that to make sure that that feels clear to them and for them to know that that information is available to them feels really important. And so we do this as a democratic process. Sometimes I frame it as we're navigating policy because in social work we talk about social policy. And so I want to try it. I'm wondering in the chat if when you are an instructor, and again, if you're a student, maybe be thinking about it from that perspective. That's also so welcome. What do you need in a hypothetical classroom space? What kinds of things would you ask for from students? Or if you're a student, from your professor? What comes to mind? And you're welcome to put those in the chat if you should feel so inclined. Engagement. Yeah. Invaluable perspective and input. I love that. Understanding and transparencies. Yeah. Engagement, collaboration. Trying not to not be interrupted, respect, attention, listening, active listening. Yeah. Culturally engaging. I love this. Time management. Yeah. Openness to learning. Beautiful. So let me share a few things of what I ask from students. An example of what I ask, and these are some of them. I'm just going to touch on one or two. Talk to me. I often tell students, I can't support you if you don't turn anything in and then it's the last week of class that you tell me you're struggling. It's really hard for me to support you because you've not reached out in advance. And so I need you to talk to me sooner rather than later. I use the term professional here and then we unpack it. And I share some of my lit review for my dissertation about the problem with the word professionalism. Now, in social work, this has a dual purpose because we talk about issues of oppression quite a lot in social work classrooms. And so this is a way in which the education, all of this community relationship building is education. It's process-oriented education. Know your lens. Know your edges, grow your edges. Embodiment is helpful here. How do you know when it's too much? It's okay for someone to say something and be too much, and you need to take a break. That's okay. You don't have to sit through that. You can get up, take a drink, take a walk. As long as I know everything's okay. If you have to leave and not come back, I'll ask that students email me. I extend these invitations because it's important to give choice. Going back to those tenets of trauma-informed care. Think critically, feel courageously. Step up, know the space you take up. Some folks are more extroverted. Classroom spaces prioritize extroverted people in lots of interesting ways, like participation grades. I have lots of quiet students who are doing a lot of incredible deep thinking. They just don't feel as comfortable in large group situations. That's where small groups are a beautiful chance for people who are quieter or perhaps less inclined to share in large group settings. Respecting time management, right? Committing to compassionate accountability, and then we talk about a process for that. So those are some of the things I ask for. And this is where operationalizing terms, and this is one of the places we'll leave off. Safe space is a really complicated term. I think this is becoming increasingly talked about, and this will be again available to you. The term brave space in the article I'm reflecting here, which is Arreo and Clemens 2013, is another alternative. I tend to say safer space. I do not promise students safe space because I don't consider that to be trauma informed. Safe space is not something one can guarantee because I can't guarantee who has enrolled in the class, their identities, their political orientation, all of the things that we associate potentially with safety or a lack of safety psychologically or emotionally. And that safe spaces historically tend to be spaces where people of like and often oppressed identities come together to process the stuff that happened in places like classrooms. And so that's where I make students aware of student resources. Like at my university, we have the Trans and Queer Advocacy Center. We have the Dowdy Multicultural Center. We have places for students to go. And when we consider intersectionality, even that can get a little complicated. But for the purpose of understanding this, often I find as a white person, I have been socialized in some ways to believe that I am safe to everyone. And I am simply not. Because by virtue of my identities, that is not realistic to assume. And so something I do with students around these community agreements, and particularly the conversation about safety, is to talk about safety plans. Who are your people? And I offer to be that person. If something messed up happens in this class and you need to debrief with someone, hey, I am right here. I'm happy to do it. And I might not be your person, and that's okay too. But who is, so that you know who to call if something gets said and you need to plan or strategize how you're going to address it. Whether that be coming to the class with community agreements and saying, I feel this community agreement has been violated. Whether that means coming to me so that I am able to support you in being heard in what has happened here that has disturbed you. But who are your people? This comes from my mental health training. We ask people who experience suicidal ideation to have a safety plan, and usually at least one of those things we ask for is who will you call? Know who, I ask students to know who their debriefing people are. We talk about self-care and community care. We talk about the campus resources, as I discussed, and then just reminding students that there doesn't have to be a forced sense of intimacy. And I love this quote. Again, it is Loretta Ross through Adrienne Marie Brown. When people think the same idea and move in the same direction, that's a cult. When people think many different ideas and move in one direction, that's a movement. It's okay for us to disagree. It's okay to be boundaried with some and feel less boundaried with others. It doesn't mean we all have to be BFFs. And that's an important thing to remember, because I notice a lot of students might feel some type of way if it feels as though they're being forced into intimacy with someone with whom they have very little in common, or perhaps even feel conflictually about. And sometimes classroom spaces, unintentionally, when this is not named, can create the space where some folks feel held expected in that way. So I only have, I think, another, oh, we're at the 40. But these are some of the things when we mess up. And the one that I will highlight is leading with curiosity. How do we lead with curiosity? And how do we let there be open doors so that we don't just close a conversation that feels unfinished and never come back to it? Because many students might need more time to process what's happened. And so open forums are a beautiful way to do this. Following up, knowing how to form a good apology. Again, for the sake of time, just going to move to these takeaways and welcoming the floor for questions. Um, this will all be available to you again, so in the event that you want to review it later. So thank you so much for listening and for engaging in the chat and for all the skills you bring to our community. I'm glad we are so well resourced together. Okay. So I'm just going to stop my share because it feels a little easier. And
The questions, Erin?
yeah,
Perfect. I'll let you address.
yeah. So let me take a peek at them really quickly. Okay. Shauna, I teach at Washington State Penitentiary in the gang units. All of my students have trauma. I recently lost my daughter to suicide. This will be my first quarterback. Is there a book you would suggest that? Yeah, one of the books I love to use, I use it in my trauma elective, is called The Politics of Trauma by Stacey Haynes. And the reason I use this is because Stacey Haynes is one of the folks who really addresses trauma from the perspective of social and political landscapes, and not just as an interpersonal or personal internal experience. And it is also very somatically oriented. But Shauna, if you would want to email me, I might be able to come up with a few more books to suggest. So please feel free to send me an email, and I would be glad to send you. I might need a little time and space to think through that. But Politics of Trauma comes top of mind. From Susan, great note about coded language. Are there some terms or words, yeah, that have become so codified that you feel it's best to use a less triggering way of expressing? Absolutely. And it's good to be attuned to that, because I think what happens is what we see is a lot of this language get co-opted. I often say it gets co-opted by capitalism. I have seen, the way that happens when I see advertisements for Pride, folks, every June. The ways in which inclusive language gets co-opted to sell us vodka and things. It's really, right now, I think we are seeing that a lot of language gets coded, used. I would say maybe rather than a less triggering way, that could be one way of entry, is thinking through what language we're using. So important. But also using that language as an example to get students thinking about, what do you think of when you hear that language? Where have you heard this before? And what has it meant to you? That can be a really powerful way to get students thinking about that language, which helps them develop critical thinking around what you say versus what you do. Because something that can cause a lot of trauma is when I say this is a safe space, and the first thing that happens is something that violates a person's sense of safety. But I've said it's a safe space. And so using that as a learning opportunity is probably the direction I would go if it's a word like safe space that often comes up in classrooms, because that gives students the ability to go to other classrooms and be thinking critically about the language if they hear it there. And that can be really protective and empowering. Do I have suggestions for resources for those of us interested in further engaging with the topic? Oh, I think there are so many beautiful resources. I love to point folks toward the book Emergent Strategy as well, which is by Adrienne Marie Brown. And that is about community organizing and movement building, but there is so much beautiful content that applies to classrooms. I have really found it to be an invaluable resource in terms of thinking about what it means to create classroom spaces that really allow everyone to show up in a meaningful way and in a way that feels right to them. Some folks are going to come in and they're going to want to be really boundaried. Maybe that's what feels correct to them. And I've seen some well-intended professors who want to create a community where everyone's really open. And sometimes those folks who want a little more boundary are coming to us for a reason with that boundary. And if we prioritize our assumption of how they perform community to us over what they're actually feeling, that creates a site of harm that is avoidable. And so I, for example, um, tend to look toward books around organizing to address classroom dynamics. So I hope that answered your question a little bit. And also you're welcome to email me if I come up with more, I'll send them your way. I see Amina, it's time.
It is. It is. Thank you so much, Erin, for this amazing presentation. Everyone, the recordings will be made available to you next week. I've also dropped the link to the slides and the Padlet in the chat multiple times, and we'll make sure that is all shared. Please go back to the agenda page to go to your next session and enjoy the rest of the summit. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.